Good afternoon, it's Max McAllister from Traction Dynamics here. We had some questions on the Goldwing forum about bumpers and things that were on the new shock and some of the stuff we found. And in particular, we had one of the front shock on the first bike we had was showing some damage to the shock bumper from the shock being bottomed out. And so we know, one of the things we observed about the design of the new shock was that the shock has a 58 millimeters of travel of stroke, but it has an unusually tall bottom out bumper, so 39 millimeters. It's roughly 60% of the travel of the shock. That's really unusual. But in our measurements and looking at, look, I've never done this. Look at that. It's cutting a piece out of this one too. Look at that, Martin. So anyway, from this shock has 19 miles on it. The dust cap on the shock is taking a core sample out of the front shock bumper. The problem with that is it will eventually start packing foam up inside this cap where it can damage the seal on the shock and potentially cause it to leak. That won't happen in 500 miles, but it will happen later in the life of the bike. But anyway, that's I can't believe that. So I was actually of the opinion that this bumper hadn't been damaged at all, but just in moving it, literally while on this video, this one has a core sample out of it as well. So what that looks like, here's the one off of the first bike. If you can come over here. These are the parts, kind of taken apart. That's a big spring seat. That's a rear bumper. We'll show you in a minute. This nut resides inside there on the shock shaft, so it kind of is all oriented in this fashion here. So when the shock comes down and bottoms, this bumper will compress dramatically. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a spring rate tester, but it will just crush quite a bit and it functions as a spring. But here's the one from the first bike. It's also got a big chunk and a core coming out of it. When the pictures, it just kind of looked like that, but we didn't know until we got it apart. It had already been cut some. So, excuse me. So anyway, there's the bumper. But just for fun, I wanted to show you what it looks like when we compress a shock bumper. This is the spring rate tester, and actually that little foam bumper has a spring rate. I'm gonna just take the slack out of our little system here until we kind of get to where we zero it, and we'll zero this. And now we're just gonna smash it. And at this point it gets really hard. So that bumper generates close to 1,000 pounds of pressure when it's, or does generate 1,000 pounds of pressure. And it compresses about 1.6 inches. This is the rear bumper off of 2018 Honda Goldwing, which is very much like identical to the bumper that was on the 2001 to 2017, pretty much the same. But you can see how far that compresses. And basically it does compress the distance of what is the shock nut, is what's left over. So you can see that barely fits there. So if you ever do hear a hard mechanical clunk bottom, that is the shock compressing so far that this nut has traveled up and clanked onto the dust cap on the shock. So it's really easy to do on the new bike because the springs are soft. Most people are riding it in the bike in the 2-up with luggage setting. Otherwise, the rear of the bike will bottom pretty easily, even with one rider on it. We have a little just a parking lot G-dip that we use to test, kind of bottom resistance of shocks here, and you just run over at about 25 miles an hour and it will bottom pretty easily. This fork bumper does mask bottoming a little better than the rear shock, but I'll show you what it looks like. So we just kind of rigged this up. We've never done this before, but having fun with Goldwings is what we're doing. I'm gonna call that 0. 0 that. 0 everything. So you kind of watch this. This one's a 2-stage bumper. So the first part sits down on the second part. So I don't know if you saw that, but the first part is gonna compress, get all the way squished flat hard, and then it's gonna start into the second bumper. Now the first one basically buries itself in the second one, and the second one ends up overall just like the first, with that approximate 1 nut's worth left when it goes hard. Like I can't really smash this any harder. So and it's roughly 32 millimeters. The bumper's 39. This nut is 7. Everything adds up to, they've got it arranged so that when it goes to bottom, it's as hard. It's at full hard. And again, that bumper, when it's on the last little bit, it jumps from 1,000 to 1,500 pounds when you really push on it hard. So basically, the same effective function as the rear bumper, but just with some extra spring rate added to the front to give it some sort of progression there. Is I guess what they're after. It is what they're after, because that's what they did. So how this is gonna affect the shocks over time, this isn't gonna disable your bike or mess it up or anything, immediately, but over time, my concern is pieces of this bumper getting up into and damaging the seal on the shock, particularly since the shock has 19 miles on it and it's already had the core chopped out of it. So, this one was 375 miles when we took it off the bike. So there's the bumpers, there's what they kind of look like, and there's what they were, kind of their function. So in conjunction with a normal mechanical spring as it moves through its range, as the shock comes down and hits the bumper, it's designed to take a spring rate, which is generally linear in function in nature, and add a progression to it at the end to help avoid the hard mechanical clunk that you might experience as the shock comes to actually mechanically bottom out. So in theory, hopefully it's enough spring pressure, the little bumper creates enough pressure that you don't ever feel a hard mechanical bottom out. But if the springs are just too soft and the bike can bottom easily, then this is what happens. We don't see that often. We would see it on the old Goldwing with if it was two riders who rode two heavy riders that rode heavily loaded. Martin, how often do you see the rear bumper on a Goldwing cord out like that?
No,
Not often?
not at all, I would say.
Not hardly
I
at
mean,
all.
it will make an impression. You can tell it's hitting the cat on the shock. Aluminum part, it will be shiny,
Yep.
so you can tell, it's
But
being
you're not
used.
seeing them cord?
No, cut up like that,
So anyway, yeah, and we've seen thousands of the previous edition shocks, but this bike is much more softly sprung, than in general than or I guess in the rear. Let's say the function of it is softer than the previous bike. So that's kind of where we're getting this coring, I'll call it, of the shock bumper. Particularly on the front. We haven't seen it on the rear yet. So this was off the same shock with 375 miles. In the rear it was fine. So no trouble there. But this we are a little concerned about. But anyway, sorry. So that's shock bumpers, and I'll have another video for you shortly of what our bike looks like with our new shocks on it. So see you in a few minutes.